Okay, well, good morning, everybody. My name is Tom Jacobs. I am the project manager for this effort to update the Regional Stormwater Design Criteria, APWA Section 5600. I'm the Chief Resilience Officer at Mid-America Regional Council, and I'd like to welcome all of you to today's session. Um, Tawn Nugent, the chair of the APWA Executive Board, will be joining us shortly. She's just leaving a board meeting, and the two of us hope to welcome all of you today to this morning's session. Next slide. Um, So this is an effort that's been carried out jointly by APWA and MARC. The APWA Executive Board authorized this project and consulted with MARC to oversee, facilitate, administer the entire process. And so we have done that together with 32 local jurisdictions. I'll dive into more detail there. Go ahead, next slide. So this whole story begins with the work of an APWA Sustainable Stormwater Task Force, which met in 2019 and 2020, which seems like a very long time ago already. That group developed a vision statement in which resilient stormwater management uses a sustainable watershed management approach that manages risk, enhances value for all, and stewards natural resources. You might not be surprised to know that we really slaved over all of these words um, and took a broad view of what we might of how stormwater management in Kansas City might continue to evolve to manage stormwater in the best way that we possibly can. This process included 11 consultants, 11 municipalities, and 10 technical advisors. And it met for about a year. And so we developed a vision statement. And Andy Sauer, and later in the slides, will go through in more detail of what's involved underneath the vision statement. But it really provided a broad conception of where we might want to go in the future. We presented this to all APWA members, and the APWA Executive Board adopted this vision statement, which has been fundamental to all of the work that we've conducted since that time. It's really been our guidepost. Next slide. On the background here, the task force recommendations charged us with doing a whole bunch of different things. And it's important to note that the first one is really to combine water quantity and water quality design standards. All the way back in 2003, when we began the last update to this process, we had said we want to combine quality and quantity in 5600. And the culmination of that work was the development of a BMP manual along with the updates to 5600. At this time, we're combining those two documents into one piece to have a more integrated approach that more meaningfully addresses this point. The design criteria previously just addressed greenfield development, and our new proposed approach also addresses redevelopment standards, and we'll dig into that in more detail. It's an important element because according to the vision statement, we really want to make things better at every turn. And so dealing with redevelopment issues creates opportunities to do that perhaps we haven't had in the past. We're updating rainfall standards, improving detention criteria to increase the functional value of detention systems. We want to promote whole system evaluations and reduce the subjectivity and technical assumptions, provide natural system design criteria, and ultimately promote resilient solutions that increase sustainability. I think this last point is particularly salient because when we did this work before, resilience wasn't a common part of our vernacular, and today it is, with all of the changes that we've all observed. And we believe that the work here will be absolutely fundamental to increasing the resilience of our community to deal with natural hazard threats associated with flooding and extreme heat and drought as well. Next slide, please. So All of this work began, as I mentioned before, back in 2019 with the APWA Sustainable Stormwater Task Force, and the recommendations were advanced to the full membership of APWA and the APWA Executive Board. And so those were authorized, and APWA asked Mark to facilitate the whole process. There was actually a discussion around that about could this project be managed on a volunteer basis from within APWA membership, and there was clear consensus that the intricacy and complexity required more of a full-time administrative and facilitative approach, which led to Mark working on this. We convened, we then sent out letters essentially to every public works director in the metro area asking for support and funding for this. And at the end of the day, 32 communities contributed funding for this work. And those communities, representatives from those communities constituted what we called a management stakeholders group. And that group convened then in the fall of 2022 to develop an RFP, beginning with kind of the vision inherent in the Sustainable Stormwater Task Force recommendations and digging in a little bit deeper. And then we managed through the procurement process in the winter of 2023 and ultimately selected a super consulting team. And so we negotiated the scope and fee in May, and we had a kickoff in July of that year. So as we go through today's presentation, then you'll see the product of very extensive deliberations. We're incredibly proud of the level of engagement that we've had throughout this process. We divided it into two phases, and the first phase was really about discovery and assessment, and the culmination of that work was to develop an outline essentially of what would go in the new version of APWA 5600. During that process, we involved over 350 people, and we really heard where there were areas of a high degree of consensus and where there wasn't, and that provided a lot of guidance to us as we moved into phase two to try and dig into the details about, how do we move this thing forward? We have a list of probably 30 different issues that we sorted through in our management stakeholders committee, and then in special focus groups and technical workshops where we sorted through all the details that Andy will walk us through in a little bit. So our intention, so we are now entering the second phase of public comment. The first phase was with management stakeholders, and once that was completed, the consulting team developed a final first draft of the product that's now available to all of you to review. And it's our hope then that as we sort through the comments that you all share with us today and in the coming 6 weeks, that we'll be able to move this towards a process for adoption, we hope in June of this year. Next slide, please. So the overarching scope here is really to improve the practice of stormwater management in the Kansas City area. And so over since 2005, 2012, there's a lot of things that have changed, right? Whether it's technology, models, data, the overarching ethos of stormwater management to address topics around sustainability and resilience. And so our goal is to address all of the issues inherent in stormwater management in a more integrated way to really just better manage stormwater. And as we scoped this project out, there was a desire for a very high level of community and stakeholder engagement, and we believe that we've done that in spades. To be honest, we're very proud of that work, and this update really reflects a new generation of thinking and how we can do a better job of managing stormwater in Metro Kansas City. So next slide, please. Mark serves a 9-county region in the bi-state metro with 119 municipalities. I previously indicated that 32 communities provided funding here. And so our hope is that these updates really provide a consistent regional approach to stormwater that serves both large and small communities, urban and rural communities, that links quality and quantity, and that does all of this work from a systems-based approach, recognizing that our watersheds cross our city and county and state boundary lines, and that by having a set of common standards that we can do a better job of dealing with the problems in front of us. That said, with all of the variability in our metro area, the system is also designed to have flexibility to recognize the context in which all the communities operate, so that the solutions that we propose are contextually appropriate. Next slide now, Lauren. So this list of project partners is the backbone of all of this work. Folks from these communities have been partners from the very beginning, and we just wanted to acknowledge their participation. This group of folks have overseen all elements of this project, from the initial consultant procurement process to managing the phase 1 and phase 2 elements of this work to get us to where we are today. So put in a whole lot of time, and we're very grateful for all of their work. Next slide, please. Our consulting team here is a terrific team. I'll introduce Andy Sauer now, who is the project manager, and the team here includes terrific staff from Burns McDonnell, Black & Veatch, Vireo, and the Center for Watershed Protection. So the team brings deep technical experience and national purview and interdisciplinary lens that we think is going to be fundamental to getting to where we need to go. So Andy, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Tom. And thank you, everybody, for joining. I apologize. We had to switch this to virtual meetings because of the weather, but I hope everybody's able to join and stay warm today. So once again, my name is Andy Sauer. I'm with Burns McDonnell. I've served as the project manager for this team. And I'd like to pause here just for a brief moment and let our team members that are with us here today that will be presenting kind of introduce themselves. So when they pop up on your screen, you know who they are. So we're going to start with Lauren Moore.
Hi, yeah, I'm Lauren Moore. I'm with Burns McDonnell. I've been serving really as the project lead for this background in stormwater management and green infrastructure. So it's been an exciting process.
With Black & Veatch, we have Matt Scott.
I'm Matt Scott with Black & Veatch. Excited to present to you all today about work that we've done relative to hydrology and collections portions of this manual.
With Vireo, we have a couple members on there. I'll start with Craig.
Hi, Craig Rhodes, Vireo, landscape architect, principal landscape architect. We kind of helped from the green infrastructure side as we move through the process.
Brett.
Good morning. I'm Brett Spangler, landscape architect at Vireo. My focus was really looking at providing information for the landscape design approach to green infrastructure.
Scott.
Scott Schulte, I'm a senior environmental planner at Vireo, and I've been helping inform the preservation aspects of the materials.
And last but not least, we have Greg with Center for Watershed Protection.
Hello, I'm Greg Hoffman with the Center for Watershed Protection. My part on this project was focusing on the water quality requirements and green stormwater infrastructure rules, as well as consulting on kind of what's going on nationally in the water quality world.
You'll hear from each of those team members as we move forward. So next slide. Real quickly, we're just going to kind of touch on some of the other, the why, some of the drivers in the process, and our process for adoption before we get into the manual here. So we've got a lot of material to cover, so I'll kind of move along here. The next slide. Many of you have probably seen this. We've talked about this way back when we had the Sustainable Task Force, but really this was kind of the why. The big thing is we're really trying to look at ways for this metro region we can reduce the overall risk. And we have some pictures that kind of depict some of the risks that as a team we've been discussing, from more flash flooding type things to severe erosion in some of our streams to other infrastructure that's failing because of stormwater management that isn't providing much control. We've also tried really hard with this design standard to devise tools and design criteria, details, and specification that will make our stormwater work harder. We want to incentivize preserving, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. And obviously, many of our communities are been introducing green infrastructure for community benefits. And the group had a lot of discussion around, maintenance costs for green. And so one of our team's, recommendations and motivations was really to provide additional design details and guidance, specifications, and things that we don't have in the current BMP manual to make our green infrastructure designs much better, in our opinion, which we believe will reduce those maintenance costs long term. And so we've really focused on that. And then trying to provide, incentives and ways that we can protect and enhance our natural systems, which obviously that's our lowest maintenance option if we can maintain the natural resources that we have. Next slide. Next slide. So I won't go into this anymore in the interest of time, since Tom covered this very well. But this is kind of where we're at. We're at the end of our phase 2 process. And we're moving into the phase where really it's part of the APWA bylaws of how Section 5600 ultimately gets adopted. And so we'll move on to our next slide. And with this, I've used this before. This is kind of our overall process. Phase 1 was shown there in the first 3 steps. And once again, Tom covered that very well. Next, there's some animation here. In phase 2, which is what we've been doing really over the last year, is really filling in all the content, writing the manual. And then throughout this, if you click next, we've been trying to engage at different levels throughout this process. And I'll talk a little bit more about that here on the next couple slides. Next. In phase 1, we really started off with this larger stakeholder engagement survey back in August of 2023. Then I'm sure many of you that are on the call here today, hopefully were able to participate in one of our focus groups, which were back in September of 2023. We also had a series of technical workshops that I know many of you participated in, which we once again thank everybody for their efforts in phase 1. And that focuses down into a detailed framework that Tom mentioned that really became the foundation for phase 2. If you go to the next slide. In phase 2, then we took that framework, that detailed outline, and we expanded it to first provide one-on-one meetings with multiple municipalities to get individual input from the cities. As well, if you remember back in June of last year, we had an APWA luncheon that I'm sure many of you attended. So we're trying to get the word out through not only meetings, but one-on-one meetings. And that led to the summer where we had some additional technical work groups that were organized by technical topic. And so those were smaller groups. So we were trying to keep those manageable. And so we worked through those in the summer of last year. And then in August and September of last year, we also had some additional focus group meetings with development engineers, and then a focus group more on the planning and policy folks. So once again, really appreciate everybody's input over the last year and a half on those different meetings. That resulted in what we called our first draft. It was really an internal draft that, as Tom mentioned, been working with the 32 management stakeholders. They reviewed that first draft, which was really in October. In November and December, then we went through a series of 4 resolution meetings. And those were 4-hour workshop type meetings trying to work through contradictory comments, key issues, those types of things. So we did those in December last year. And if you go to the next slide, that has resulted then in, drum roll, the second draft, which is the draft that is out for public release. So we finished that up in just into the last month. So it's hot off the presses. And so that's what we're really going to focus the rest of this meeting on, is what is in the new 5600. Obviously, it's going to look and feel a lot different than what the current 5600 is. Next slide. I'm going to cover these fairly quickly so we can stay on time, but just wanted to cover a few things. If you go to the next slide. One, it's one consolidated manual. So we're using the 5600 layout, but you'll see all the section numbers, maybe familiar numbers, but they're going to represent different technical criteria now. So that's the outline we'll be going through. That's the new table of contents for the new manual. Next slide. The big things that have changed, I want to draw your attention to what I'm calling the top 10 list, and I'll touch on a few of these that are in bold here in the different color. But really, we've talked about one manual. The other big thing is we're moving to a runoff reduction method, which will replace the BMP value rating system. We're also moving to a layered approach for stormwater management. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. The triggers for stormwater management are slightly different, a little bit more restrictive. We're updating the rainfall volumes, duration, and distributions. And one thing that I'm really excited about, and I think will really make our stormwater infrastructure work harder, is we're allowing retention and detention to work together. So when you do retention-based practices, you're going to be required to do less detention. So that's one way we can make these solutions more affordable and work harder. We have specific design requirements now. There's a lot of detail in there. You'll see this new manual is over 300 pages long with a lot of detail and specifications. We have design components that Lauren will talk about. And we've really spent a lot of time with Vireo's assistance on better landscaping criteria based on some real lessons learned over the last 15 years. We really think that's going to help with lowering maintenance as well. And then we now have operation, maintenance, and design submittals as separate sections. So we're really highlighting what's required for operation and maintenance as well as design submittals. Next slide. So I'm going to just touch on these for everybody's background. I won't have a whole lot of time to get into these, but really by combining the quality and the quantity criteria, really we're going to eliminate the conflicts between the two manuals, which have happened in the past. We're hoping that these will reduce the overall cost to provide overall stormwater management at a site level. And we think this will improve the functional value as we move forward. So we really think those are some key benefits. Next. On the runoff reduction method, this has been an important change. We want to retain stormwater on site. That doesn't necessarily just mean infiltration. As these systems are vegetated, we get canopy interception, we get evapotranspiration, and we get extended filtration with underdrain. So when we talk about retention, I want to make sure everybody understands we're not just talking about that everything has to be 100% infiltrated. We are providing their opportunities as well as nature itself will obviously evapotranspirate the water. And every volume or gallon of water we can retain on site really gives us 100% pollutant removal. So really a much better benefit from a water quality standpoint as well. Next slide. We also know that this type of method of a runoff reduction volume method is used in many states. So we're not on the cutting or bleeding edge here. We're just really, you see the trend of moving to more of a runoff reduction method across the country, including even with the state of Kansas with KDOT's requirements for a half-inch retention on site with KDOT projects. So anyway, we feel that we're aligning with the state of the practice across the country. Next slide. Retention and detention are now together. So when you retain on site, you'll be able to take credit for that, and we'll talk a little bit about that later in the calculations. And we're providing design tools that will allow you to calculate that reduction in detention sizing. So really, there's a lot of benefits that are listed, but really, one of the key things I want to point out is it reduces the footprint area of the on-site stormwater management. And we have run multiple scenarios with real projects, which will be included in the appendix materials to really be able to demonstrate that the new manual doesn't require additional footprint area in most cases, and we'll get additional value for that as we move forward. Next slide. Layered approach. Lauren's going to talk more about this later, so I won't go into this in too much detail. But you see the layers there: first preserving and restoring, then retaining, and then detention. So the manual and the requirements are laid out that way. You'll see that here in a few minutes. Next slide. And our design components. This is just one rendering. We have a lot of renderings, details, but we also have the details by component. So we have details for how water comes into a green infrastructure. We have details for the piping, the soil media, the storage aggregate. So we really hope that this will improve the overall consistency of designs across the metro area and lead to lower maintenance and higher functioning green infrastructure. Next slide. All right, let's talk about the manual. That's just kind of the background. Let's get into the nuts and bolts. We are proposing, or I guess, requiring, because we're going to have a lot of comments, which we appreciate, but we're providing 2 ways you can make your formal comments. We have a Bluebeam session that is out on the MARC website that you can click on. And if you're familiar with Bluebeam, you'll be able to go into the PDF and make comments directly in there. We also have provided a digital survey form by section. That just popped up there on the right. I think Lauren brought that up. And so you go in there and you can fill in your question by the different section. The reason we want to know which section you're commenting on is so that we can relate your comment back to the actual manual section. All that is available up on the MARC website. The QR code is there. And I think Natalie might be putting it in the chat as well. But really we're only going to take written comments in those 2 forms so that we can document the comments and provide a response to comment. In today's process, we'll address your questions on kind of the content in the background and clarification questions, but formal questions or formal comments, sorry, should be made through one of these 2 processes. We'll repeat this at the end of the presentation today. Next slide. All right. I only got us 2 minutes off, so I'm going to turn it over to Lauren here. Here's our schedule for going through the different sections. You'll notice at the end of, we have 3 Q&A sessions for 10 minutes. We're going to try to keep it to 10 minutes so we can stay on schedule. And once again, glad to respond to your comments on kind of the overall context and content, but not specific detailed questions or comments. Those will have to be made by one of those other 2 processes. You can put questions in the chat. We'll be monitoring that. And then when we pause for Q&A, you can also come off mute and you can ask your question verbally too by raising your hand. So that makes sense. I'm going to turn it over to Lauren.
Yeah, thank you. And I did want to let everyone know that this is being recorded today. So we will record this and have this posted up on the MARC website as well. So you can reference back to this overview and any of the content in there. So we're going to kind of walk through each section of the manual, starting with the preamble and the introduction. Really, we've got a preamble on the front end of this, and it just provides a lot of the background information that you just heard Tom and Andy go through, talking about the timeline, the Sustainable Task Force, and really a lot of the why behind the manual updates. We then start to get into the meat of it. We've got the introduction that starts into talking about the different project types. So we define these up front. And really the manual is trying to take an equitable approach to applying stormwater criteria to different project types rather than the previous one-size-fits-all requirements. The goal here is really to better balance mitigating impacts to how stormwater is managed from a site or a project with the feasibility of meeting those standards, really with the intent to have fewer total variances because the criteria is better aligned to the project type. So we've got criteria that differs from new development to redevelopment. So lesser quantity control is required for redevelopment projects, but still wanting to promote redevelopment opportunities while providing some level of stormwater control. And then we define 3 different project types. So we've got site development, which is really your traditional type of development from residential, commercial, industrial type projects, but also includes solar farms and linear and non-linear municipal utilities or utility facilities. Both public and private is kind of the key there. So we're applying these standards to everybody. The second type that you'll see here is the public roadway improvements, and that's within the public right-of-way to the street or associated public stormwater infrastructure. So public roads make up, upwards of 30% or more of our impervious area, and sometimes even more than that, really. So they're a major contributor to stormwater runoff and a major factor in how we're able to manage it. A couple things to point out, though, is that it does not include resurfacing within an existing paved section, linear trail improvements or emergency type repairs, as well as roads developed as part of site development. That falls under the site development category. So really, this is intended to fall into the public roadway improvements only. And then the last project type here is utility improvements, meaning linear utility improvements. So gas, communications, water, sanitary, stormwater improvements. And in general, these types of improvements are exempt from a lot of the stormwater management criteria. But if you're impacting the storm system, you're still required to meet the collection and conveyance criteria. So as Andy mentioned before, we've set up the entire manual around this layered approach or these priorities of stormwater management, looking to really promote preservation or restoration first. That's our really cheapest and easiest way to manage stormwater naturally. And then moving to retain what we can on site. And then third in that tier is detain. At the bottom, you'll see collection and conveyance, because those are really components of the storm drainage system that happen at any given point within those priorities. And maintenance is really a key component into making sure these assets work long-term as well. So the entire manual is really set up and structured around these priorities. So the last section in the introduction is how to use this manual. And it really walks the user high level through the content of each subsequent section. It also calls attention to our Appendix A, which is the definition section. But we've got blue bolded text throughout the manual that you'll see that really highlights that it's a defined term that you can go find the associated definition for in the appendix. Those terms are defined, bolded the first time it appears in a section, so like 5601, or a subsection, so 5601.1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And that's, again, just to try to give that definition around the context of that important term if you're just jumping to a single section or subsection. So 5602, we've got stormwater management requirements that I'll talk through here in a second, but it's really the first stop for the user to understand what controls are required for their site based on their project types. 5603 is hydrology. So what are the rainfall inputs and the appropriate methodologies that we use to calculate those requirements? And there's references here to the relevant appendices that really support those sections too. Then 5604 through 5608 really gets into the detailed design criteria. So now that you know what you have to do for your site, this defines how to design each of those components and to meet those requirements, starting with preservation and restoration practices, retention and detention practices and their components, and then collection and conveyance. And then 5609 discusses the operations and maintenance requirements for the stormwater system components that are being used on the project. And last but not least is 5610, which really summarizes all the submittal requirements with the goal of setting a consistent standard for what's required to be submitted across the region. So from one community to the next, we've got similar expectations on what you're not only putting together from a developer's engineer standpoint, but what you're seeing on the reviewer side of things as well. That brings us into 5602, which is the stormwater management requirements. So we start off this section talking about applicability of the criteria, and this is not dissimilar to how the current 5600 starts, but the criteria applies to all new development and redevelopment, both public and private projects, and then references those project types again. Similar to the current 5600, there's a list of exemptions. This time around, we are basing the exemptions on disturbed area rather than just impervious area. This was really to better align with regulatory requirements around MS4 and to acknowledge that stormwater management is impacted by much more than just impervious area. So the first exemption, it has to fulfill both of these requirements, but basically, if a project disturbs less than half an acre and has less than 5,000 square feet of impervious area total, there's no stormwater management required. So if it's a smaller site that does not have a significant impact on impervious area, you're exempt from the requirements altogether. The second exemption is related to single family and duplex developments that are not part of a larger common plan. So this is not subdivision type development. These are individual lots being developed by a single homeowner. But if it meets either of these criteria, it's exempt. So if the lot size is less than 1 acre, you have no stormwater management requirements. Or if your impervious coverage is less than 35%, you have no requirements. And then the third exemption, again, consistent with current 5600, is if stormwater management has been provided as part of an earlier approved phase of work, assuming fully built conditions, there's no additional requirements that apply. So if you've got a phase development that handles the stormwater management up front, you're not expected to redo that each time you enter into a new phase of development. So there's a couple flow charts in there too, really just to help walk the user through those exemptions and whether or not stormwater management applies on their project. So then we really get into the heart of the requirements for runoff reduction method that Andy had kind of introduced before. Again, starting with preservation and restoration, then going into retention, and that's really controlled by the runoff reduction volume, or RRV. You'll hear me say a lot. And then detention, which is still built around released rates. So aligning with the priorities of stormwater management, the manual starts with preservation and restoration. The only real hard requirement around preservation and restoration is related to the stream setbacks, but there are a lot of incentives to reducing your RRV, which we call RRV reductions, that are also introduced in this section. We define the term natural area, which is used to describe preserved or restored areas of a project that have been put within a dedicated tract restricted from future development. So here's some of the RRV reductions that are introduced in this section. So if you incorporate these type of practices into your site or your development, your overall runoff reduction volume requirement goes down. So each of these has an associated credit that comes out of the total RRV for the site. And this section is set up with equations and graphics to kind of help the user walk through and apply those. One thing I want to point out is that natural areas, whether they're preserved or restored, are really double incentivized if being used to manage stormwater. So then we get into the retention section. So again, you see the performance requirements table by project type. So you'll see this consistent table that that lays out what those requirements are. So ideally, the user can kind of grab that information quickly up front. You'll see that new development has significantly higher control requirements than redevelopment, again, trying to align with feasibility and available space for implementation. One other thing I want to point out is that the linear utility improvements are really exempt from the runoff reduction requirements just because of their limited impact and limited options to be able to control stormwater when we're talking about a linear utility. There's also requirements included for combined sewer areas. Really, retention has the biggest positive impact on CSO issues. So increased control requirements in combined sewer areas helps to align those requirements of our major CSO communities with their existing standards and consent decrees. So here's the calculation for the required retention volume, or RRV. And this is really the heart and soul of our water quality requirement for the manual. So this replaces the former value rating system. This is our water quality requirement. So just kind of walking through these parameters, P is our water quality storm event. It's that rainfall depth, which is still 1.37 inches. N represents our natural area, and yes, 0.00 is intentional, as the calc assumes no runoff from natural areas. And the intent here is to really over-incentivize this to promote this type of practice. It's easy for the user to see how big of an impact incorporating the natural area for preservation or restoration into your project can have on your total site RRV. So ideally, you're looking at these opportunities up front to reduce your total stormwater management requirements for the whole project. We then have impervious area, and then pervious area, which is really generic pervious area. And then we've got some unique land covers defined as well, like for solar panels, gravel, and turf. And those were some of the kind of nuancy pieces that came out of the resolution meetings for different land types that we see questioned quite frequently, and also part of development in the KC region. And then the last piece on here is the PT percentage, which we call the project type modifier. And basically this is that reduction factor that you get to apply to your total equation based on your project type and whether it's new or redevelopment. Then we move into detention. So detention requirements, again, defined by project type. It's similar to the current 5600 in that detention is managed by controlled release rates. But the emphasis has really been changed to focus on tighter controls on the more frequent storm events. So 2-year and 10-year, so that detention is providing a benefit most of the time rather than only during those more extreme events. So we're really trying to make our infrastructure work harder for us rather than in those less frequent times. And a big thing we want to point out here again is that you get to take credit for the retention volume provided upstream by applying a lower overall curve number that factors in that volume as part of the initial extraction. So that's going to inherently reduce the amount of detention that you have to do by meeting those retention requirements upstream. This is new. Formerly, water quality and detention were really completely separate and have to stack those requirements. The last subsection within here are runoff reduction performance calculations, and I don't expect you guys to be able to see or read these, but really I just wanted to kind of give you a screen grab of it. But this walks you through step by step the calcs and equations that were introduced in those previous 3 subsections. So it aligns with a KC compliance calculator tool that we developed. So really trying to make this a smooth and easy process for the user to go through. That KC compliance calculator is part of Appendix D. It's a macro-enabled Excel file. So we've got buttons, user inputs, and auto-calculated fields to ideally make this pretty user-friendly. That's posted up to the MARC website as well. So I encourage you guys to download that and play around in it. For now, we've left it unlocked. Wanted to be transparent with how it's built and the calculations and assumptions that are going in there. But when we finalize it, we'll lock that down so that users can't accidentally modify fields that aren't intended to be modified. And then there's a couple different tabs within there. So we've got an instruction sheet up front that has instructions by each tab. Again, hopefully that makes it nice and easy to use for the user. And then we've got site inputs. So that's where you're inputting your drainage areas and understanding what your total RRV requirements are. And then we got detailed design sheets as well. So that's where you can calculate your RRV reductions, your retention volume, and your detention for each of the drainage areas for your site. So then we move into the collection and conveyance performance requirements. So this isn't novel, where these are still lie and gutter spread and conveyance level of service. So we'll talk about these in more detail in later sections here too. And then last but not least in this section, we've got this example applications and renderings. Really the intent is to give an idea of how retention practices can be integrated into different types of development. So promote providing multi-benefit, multi-purpose solutions that can really enhance the value of a project or a site rather than sticking a big hole in the back corner and just going straight to detention. So we've got some renderings and some text that walk through these different scenarios of parking lot, garage, commercial infill, residential development, and streetscape. With that, I think we can move on to 5603 hydrology.
Yeah, thanks, Lauren. I believe some folks joined. Matt Scott with Black and Beach. I'm going to walk through a hydrology section here. Next slide. So we'll start each of these sections moving forward with just a quick look at the table of contents. Within hydrology, we have it organized as shown. First is application of hydrologic calculations. So the intent is to walk designers through step by step how to apply this section when developing a site or applying the calculations. Then we speak to meteorology and the rainfall depths and rainfall distributions. Then runoff generation methods, so getting into the details of hydrologic calculations, watershed calculations, and such. And then finally, rational method, some brief 2D modeling guidance. And I don't get into it in any detail later in the slide, so I'll just say about 2D modeling. There's a lot of good references that exist relative to different modeling platforms. What you'll find upon reviewing the manual is kind of an overview of best practices, and expecting those doing 2D modeling to follow, the specifics of their modeling software appropriately. And then finally, hydrologic evaluation. So I'm not going to step into each of these in detail, just in the interest of time. The whole manual is available to comment upon, as Andy said, and we'll throw the QR code up later, and Natalie's been posting the link in the chat. But I will address a few items in more specifics just to highlight. So first, rainfall volumes. One big update with this manual is moving off of the TP40 rainfall volumes to the more recently updated NOAA Atlas 14. But first, suffice to say, we did take a look at the water quality volume, which is the rainfall event that corresponds to 90% of rainfall events in the Kansas City area, so that if you capture that volume, you're capturing 90% of rainfall events. That number didn't really change based on local rainfall records, so that remains at 1.37 inches. For NOAA Atlas 14, we calculated the average of rainfall volumes across all watersheds across the entire MARC region. So these are MARC area averaged rainfall volumes that we've got in the manual. So just the table below, for a variety of recurrence intervals that we use frequently as stormwater designers, there's a comparison. So first column to the right is precipitation frequency estimates done by professors at KU back in 2002. And then comparing that to Atlas 14, the average for the 8 counties in the MARC region, and then a comparison back to TP40 for this region. So we see a lot of alignment for the more frequent events, and then Atlas 14, as we go to the less frequent events, there is a divergence. There's some larger volumes there. So just wanted to point that out for context, and that is one of the more significant changes in the hydrology section of the report manual. Next slide. The next thing you'll note is some different guidance relative to rainfall distributions. So on the, you'll see 2 different rainfall distributions. First, for inlets and conveyance, or collection and conveyance, there's a nested distribution. And so that's shown there, plotted on the left in 10-minute increments. So that's a 6-hour storm. We did do analyses. We did a review of available data and reports, and this was where we settled based on that and some hydrologic modeling of watersheds as being a good representative for the KC metro area for a 10-year 6-hour storm. For detention, there's a different distribution, NOAA Atlas 14 temporal distribution, and you'll see that it's very front-loaded. NOAA Atlas 14, in one of the appendices, they looked at historic rainfall events. This distribution represents kind of an average of rainfall events rather than the most extreme. So this is the distribution you'll find in the manual for detention. Next slide. This is those same 2 distributions, just plotted differently, where as you go right over time, it's a cumulative percentage. So again, just showing the same information slightly differently. This figures in the manual as well. The green NOAA temporal distribution, again, a lot of the volume falls up front, whereas there is that peak with the 6-hour nested distribution, which targets, the conveyance elements and their sizing. Next slide. Another change with the rational method, and this was, a topic through all of the engagement with stakeholders, but, it was in the manual, you'll find the rational method is limited compared to previous iterations of the manual. It is only allowed to be used for a peak runoff rate to a single point on collection and conveyance components. And this is only for drainage areas less than 40 acres. And it's really only appropriate for unmanaged drainage areas, i.e. there's not reservoirs that are significantly changing the flow regime upstream. And as I mentioned, it's only allowed for calculating inflow to a single drainage element like a culvert or a single inlet. Next slide. And then finally, you'll find more detailed rainfall data in Appendix C so that you can create these storm distributions, and especially the nested storm distribution. These are area-weighted rainfall averages for the MARC region, again, just relative for different recurrence intervals and a variety of time intervals for the designers to use. Next slide. So I guess, Lauren, at this point, we have a Q&A session if you want to introduce that.
Yeah, so in between each kind of grouping of sections that we present, as Andy had mentioned, we want to have a 10-minute Q&A section to address any kind of overarching questions about the manual itself, how it's organized, or any of the content that we just covered. And I can't see the chat, so if someone else can read any questions that come in through the chat, that would be great.
Yeah, that's what I was looking at, Lauren or Natalie or others. I don't see any questions in the chat, or I'm looking at the chat right. So if others see questions, let me know. If you have a question, I believe you can raise your hand. Trying to come off of mute and ask your question.
I do not see any hands raised.
Okay. Do I have to ask if everybody's still awake? Who's multitasking out there? Come on. Covered a lot of content back there. We can, keep going to stay on track. I will pause here for a second. I know Ton with APWA came on late. I don't know if you're still on, Ton, if you want to introduce yourself real quick since you weren't able to join us. Thank you.
Thanks, Andy. Yeah, I was coming off our board meeting, so
Yeah.
I was a little late. I just want to thank the team here for all the efforts on behalf of APWA KC Metro. This has been a big endeavor. As I mentioned, we started in 2011 working on this, so this is kind of exciting to be to this point. I know there's a lot of changes and a lot of conversations still happening. So I know this is the first time you guys are all seeing this, but as I represent KC Metro, it's important that the communities are given feedback and making sure that this is something that our organization can get behind, because we have contributed. We're one of those 32 partners that have contributed $50,000 so far to this effort. So this is an important effort from the chapter. So again, I'm here to listen, and I'm also, if you want to reach out to me with specific comments, questions, I'd be happy to take those back to the committee as well. So thanks, Andy.
Thank you. We do have a few questions now coming up in the chat. I don't know. One, Matt here, I don't know if you see it there, about the 10% detention design frequency within these storms and not 10% for a given time interval. I think they might be referring to the 10% quartile, maybe.
Yeah, I think that's Brian, maybe if you can just elaborate a little bit more.
Sure, I'll come off mute if that's okay. I guess
Please.
when I think of a 10% storm, and maybe it's just my lack of understanding of the temporal distributions, I typically think that the return intervals for a given depth within each duration are about 10%, but my understanding of the temporal distributions is that that's not the case, that they kind of range quite a bit. So I guess if you could just kind of educate me on what they mean by 10% when they look at for example, I noticed on your chart you had a 10% one as an example, so just hoping you can elaborate a little bit on that.
Yeah, so the 10% really refers to the total event rainfall volume. As you know, there is a variety of recurrence intervals because it is based on historic rather than a constructed hyetograph would look like the nested. And so because it is based on historical data, you do see a variety. So to answer your question directly, it's a 10-year event because the total volume of the rainfall event corresponds, to a 6-hour rainfall volume.
Cool.
But the 10% means that it's more 90% of all 6-hour storms were less than or equal to that, right? So we're using the 10%, the most least frequent of those events, right? So it gives you distributions from 10% all the way to 90% within that 10 years. So it's a difficult one to to present, but we'd be glad to talk more about that if you have more detailed questions on that.
Sure,
And
Andy. Yeah,
we've
thank you
had a
both.
bunch of questions pop on since then. We've got one from Logan Healy says, am I correct that tear down, rebuild, single family home construction would be exempt? And if so, why?
If it falls below those thresholds, it would be. So if it's less than an acre, like the property size is less than 1 acre, or if it has less than that 35% impervious coverage. This was a pretty hot topic that we debated within those resolution meetings, and voted with the management stakeholders on a different range of triggers for that. So really the intent is to not put undue onerous on development of a single homeowner on a lot that's frankly harder to control, both from the homeowner side of things, but also from the municipality side of things, as far as regulating and actually implementing successful types of BMP practices. So if they are larger, if they fall outside of those thresholds, then the stormwater management requirements do still apply.
Okay, we have another question from Kevin Roner. How does the new criteria coincide with KCMO's criteria for CSO requirements?
Yeah, I'll take that one. It doesn't exactly align. We were trying to find I don't know if I want to say a compromise, but a meaningful improvement to the overall CSO requirements without making them more restrictive. So it generally does align, but not exactly, because of the way Lauren laid out. We're trying to have this multi-phased approach. So the CSO is close to what we currently require, but not exactly, if that makes sense. So it's kind of we're making it a little bit more detailed, in my opinion. So I think it's going to work better than the current criteria. The current criteria was kind of an overall blanket, which I think causes more confusion. So that's why we went this way with that. So yes, it's in general lines, but it's slightly different.
Okay, we have got a question about technical training. Once this is adopted, will there be more in-depth technical training for engineers on how to develop designs within the manual?
I'll take this one, Andy. We've had detailed conversations with the consulting team about offering in-depth technical training. So once our hope is that APWA membership will vote to adopt this in June, followed by the adoption of these standards by local governments around the community. And so we would prepare and offer a series of trainings for anybody who's interested, beginning in, we hope, the fall of this year.
We've got another question about gravel parking and roadways, and if that's something that's being encouraged as a management method.
I don't know if it's being encouraged. I don't know, Lauren. I mean, we do have different runoff reduction or runoff values for gravel roads, right? Versus whether it's, you want to take that one? Sorry.
Yeah. So that's one of those unique land covers that we address within that calc. It's not intended to promote using those. It's just intended to acknowledge that we have runoff patterns that differ when you have those types of surfaces. So within the gravel category, we've got 3 different really subcategories for that. Whereas basically a gravel road is treated the same as a paved road. It's mostly functioning as an impervious because we've got a lot of compacted subgrade fines and things like that over time that it's going to function that way. Whereas if we've got like a gravel parking lot or gravel around a substation, that's going to produce less runoff. So that was really the intent with those different gravel subtypes for the land covers. But no, not intended to promote using one over the other, just to address some of the unique situations we see in design, not over penalize the use of gravel.
Okay.
I also see that I think we'll have to move on here in 1 second. One more question. I know Gene's had his hand up there, Joe.
Yeah,
So I was
that's
gonna.
who I was going to get to next. He's got his
Yeah,
hand
yeah,
up. I don't
yep,
know, Gene,
yep.
if you want to come on and ask on over video, or just want me to read what you put in the text. Gene, are you there?
You just want to read what he has, I guess.
Yeah. So he asked, it appears the 2 and 10-year allowable release rates are changing substantially, especially the 10-year event now going to 0.6 CFS per acre.
Yeah, I knew we'd get a question on that. I'll take that. And that's really, I'll encourage everybody to dive into when we move to the temporal distributions, and we're trying to really detain for those frequent events. So those release rates are based on calibrated USGS model we developed down for the Grandview area and a few other monitored areas that we have for natural runoff conditions. So those release rates will seem really low to people, but when you apply the temporal distributions compared to an SCS type 2 distribution, and like I mentioned, we've run multiple scenarios, so those do work really well, but they are much lower than what you're going to be typically thinking for release rates. So that is one thing to kind of review and think about, but it really is driven by the fact we're moving to temporal distributions so that we're retaining and detaining those frequent events and then slowly releasing them, really for a stream morphology benefit, which was one of our goals to reduce stream erosion. So that's where those come from. So please look at those. That is an important criteria.
And just to kind of add to that, that was really a direct response to how we have observed our detention basins performing over the last 20 or so years. Most basins are functioning as flow-through cells right now. So 99.9% of the rain events that we get are just flowing straight in and straight out, and we're not getting any actual detention benefit, which is really what's impacting our streams and our downstream systems so significantly.
Right.